Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for coming to today's lecture. Before I introduce the speaker, I just want to say a word on behalf of the Drescher Center for the Humanities. This event, as you might well know, is part of the Drescher Center's 2024 Humanities Forum, and as it's a free public lecture series organized, as I said, by the Drescher Center. I'd like to share with you the next event in this series, which will take place in a few weeks, because it's the very famous Daphne Harrison Lecture. And it's taking place Tuesday, October 29th at 5:30 p.m. right here in the Library Gallery. And the title of the lecture is James Baldwin and the Art of Late Style, Dagmawi Wubset of the University of Pennsylvania is giving the lecture. Something about the lecture, here's a blurb. In the 100 years since his birth, James Baldwin has become the most cited literary artist, living or dead, on matters of race on social media since the Ferguson Uprising. His words deployed to expose white power and innocence and express black rage and ethics. However, this emphasis on the author's 1960s civil rights era writings eclipses the body of literary work he produced from the mid-1970s until his death in 1987. In this talk, Wubset will focus on the author's neglected later writings, which foreground black interior and intra-racial life, recasting a black world unencumbered by the white-black racial antagonism that drives much of Baldwin's early writings. To learn more, I encourage you to look at the Drescher Center website, dreschercenter.umbc.edu. You can also connect with the Drescher Center on social media. Okay, so that's the blurb from the Drescher Center. And now I'm going to introduce our speaker. My introduction is up here. I'm also going to take this opportunity to remove the coat because it's extremely warm.
It's very warm.
Yeah. So maybe we could turn up the air conditioning if somebody has the ability to do that. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Phillip Mitsis, who is the Alexander S. Onassis Professor of Hellenic Culture and Civilization at NYU. Professor Mitsis got his BA from Williams College and his PhD from Cornell University, and the breadth of his scholarship and teaching is truly astonishing. He's excelled in teaching and scholarship in philosophy, literature, music, and painting. And though he bears the title Professor of Hellenic Culture and Civilization at NYU, he's also an affiliate professor of philosophy, and he's affiliate professor of medieval and Renaissance studies. He has taught all over the world. He's taught at Cornell, where I met him in 1981, where he was my teacher. He has taught at NYU, he's taught at Princeton, he's taught at Oxford, and for an entire decade he taught at the NYU Global Campus in Abu Dhabi. So Professor Mitsis is a specialist in Hellenistic philosophy, especially the philosopher Epicurus. His first book, Epicurus' Ethical Theory, The Pleasures of Invulnerability, has come out in various editions since it was published in English in 1988. It's been published in German, in French, in Italian, and in Greek. He's edited and co-edited books on drama, poetry, and philosophy, and has published about 75 articles and chapters. And before I tell you what he's talking on today, I just want to give the Drescher Center thanks for its support, and the Department of Philosophy also has supported this lecture. So the Ancient Studies Department thanks both of them. And Professor Mitsis today will be talking to us on Plato, on the morality of hate. So without further ado, I'll give you Professor Mitsis.
So we're going to reiterate, thanks to the Drescher Center, also the Ancient Studies Initiative and philosophy, etc. And when Professor Rosenblum first called me and invited me, you know, your initial response is always, yeah, that sounds great, I'd love to do that. You know, I wanted to see him, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then the sad moment sets in when you say, well, I actually got to talk about something. And I'm not sure I have anything to talk about. And then I started, you start fretting. You know, like when you're writing a paper, you think, get some ideas, you start fretting. And for me, it's only slightly interesting, but I'll tell you the genesis of this paper. I was standing in a New York subway, West 4th Street, close to where I live. I don't know if you've been in a New York subway lately. Pretty nasty. I'm sitting there and like the stench is incredible. Like you're sitting there going, the mask is not even helping. And I'm seeing a sign that says, this is no place for hate. I'm going, huh. Yeah. I don't really love the smell of the subway. Okay, maybe I could learn to respect this smell and understand its organic compounds and do that, but I don't know if I'm ever really going to be able not to hate this smell. So it put me in this mind of saying, oh, okay, they were just talking about smells. And I started thinking, well, is there stuff that I really hate? I was thinking back to my traumas in youth. I was a busboy in a country club. And all the rich kids were treating me like sort of the dirt on the bottom of their tennis shoes without respect. And I was going, you know what I really hate? I guess I hate being treated that way. I kind of hate inequality. I was thinking to myself, yeah, maybe I hate inequality. And I walked into my NYU classroom. Guess what it said? This is not a place for hate. So I'm going, okay, I guess I shouldn't hate inequality. I mean, maybe I should come to respect the people and the process of not showing me respect. I should respect that lack of giving me. And it's starting, you get into one of those Zen cones, which is very hard to figure out. And I was sort of thinking, I don't know, there's a problem here with hate. And as luck would have it, I happened to be reading Plato. And I have some passages here, which I'll look at, and he gives various reasons and various arguments about hate. And as I was sitting there, looking at these passages, I said, hey, I got a topic. So I sent off a little abstract to Professor Rosenblum saying, I want to talk about hate in Plato. Now, in the meantime, I started doing some reading, and I also had said at the time, well, one of the really interesting things about doing ancient philosophy is a lot of times they look at things different from the way the modern people do, and we have a whole shtick about that. That's how we sort of survive, is by saying, if you look at what we do, there's some interesting differences, and modern philosophers don't look at it that way, and you should look at us, and that's why you should have an ancient philosophy program. So we do that. So I was going, yeah, I'm going to do that number. And then when I started looking around, it turned out that this idea, what I'm going to call maybe good hate, or the morality of hate, that you should hate things that are bad or evil and love things that are good, is through the whole tradition from Plato on, all the way up to about the 19th century, and Kant and the utilitarians. And I'll say a little something about that. But it's widespread, and it's with all kinds of philosophers. They can be materialists, physicalists, you name it. You look at the great tradition. Most of the philosophers, there's some voices that disagree, and I'll talk about those, think that if you're going to be a moral person, you should learn how to hate things that are bad and love things that are good. So my first little passage here, I jumped all the way from Plato up to Edmund Burke. I don't know how many of you, when you do I don't want to pull a boomer moment here. I couldn't get my shoes on, so I'm wearing my boomer, shoes here. My feet were swollen from all the barbecue we did. So sorry. but it's going to be a boomer moment. The shoe fits the moment. And that is, Burke, he disapproved of the French Revolution. And after he wrote his great work on the French Revolution, which, people used to have to read selections from in my generation, he wrote this letter, which was called, it's Letters on the Regicide of Peace. He was against Britain striking a peace with France because they'd killed their king. And here's what he says. And this is, kind of prose, 18th century prose that not a lot of people read and enjoy. But he says, a kind providence has placed in our breasts a hatred of the unjust and cruel, in order that we may preserve ourselves from cruelty and injustice. And then when he's talking about kind providence, he's talking about God, Christian God. They who bear cruelty are accomplices in it. The pretended gentleness, which excludes that charitable rancor, produces an indifference which is half an approbation. And that's something I'm going to be talking about a lot. That if you don't actually hate something evil and you're indifferent to it, you're almost giving it an approbation. You're almost approving it in some way by not doing that. That's Plato's view. That's much of the tradition's view. They never will love where they ought to love, who do not hate where they ought to hate. And that is a kind of general refrain in the whole tradition. It goes through the Greek tradition, the pagan tradition, the Christian tradition. I'll look at some Christian texts. Some of you might be surprised about that when you look at the Christian texts, about God as well. But that there's this connection between hating bad things, loving good things, and you have to do both. And you can't just love something, and then be indifferent about the rest. That it doesn't show that you truly love the good. So that's essentially sort of the thoughts that we're going to be having. That was behind looking at these passages. And when you look at Plato and the tradition, there are many places where their argument is you need to marshal both the powers of hate, either at an emotional level or at a rational level, or even at a kind of mimicking the divine level in order to be a moral human being. So, you may disagree and we'll talk about it. You may have an initial may have lots of worries about that. You should, because we don't hear it very often these days. We typically see a sign that says, no hate here. We go, yeah, no hate here. Or you hear about hate speech. Since about 1980, almost all philosophy, if you hear the word hate, it's only about hate speech. And of course, nobody, thinks that hate speech is a good thing because you're saying bad things about things that you shouldn't hate. This is the claim. Remember, all the way through, and we can talk about how this works. All the people who are making this argument say we can agree about some things that are evil. We can give arguments for that, and those are things you should hate. And you can think about all sorts of things, and we'll talk about the sorts of things in your lives that you think, or in public life or everything, are really hate-worthy. And then the question is, what do? You say, oh, okay, fine by me, but I don't want to hate anything. Or whether the moral person actually is mandated to hate those things. So the first sort of area I want to look at is in education or pedagogy. Now, most of the tradition, and certainly Plato, thinks that from the moment you're born, you have these twin kinds of, you might say, either instincts or desires or something. One positive, one negative. It can go all the way up to something as strong as love, something as strong as hate. If you look back, you might say, well, look back, I hated ice cream and sweets, couldn't stand them. I loved radicchio and bitter things. That was me. Other people had different ways. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. But Plato thought, given that you're endowed with those twin instincts or desires of love and hate, if you want to educate someone, Well, the way you educate them is by using those as the two sort of, he calls them rudders, of getting the ship, along the path of something, how you want to educate someone. Think about it, when you're educated, there are things that you're sort of taught to like. You're taught to like, I don't know, shopping. Think about the things that you're taught to hate. All sorts of things you might be taught to hate. But Plato's view, if you want to get this correct, now remember Plato's talking about, these passages are from his last work called The Laws when he was an old man. But I don't want you to think these are just the, ruminations of a grumpy old man. You can find this all through his corpus, including the Republic. And I have a passage his most central passage in the Republic is about love and hate and the importance of hate in a different context. So you might say, when you're educating someone, how do you educate children? You try to get them to like certain things and hate certain things. So this first passage is one I really like, and I certainly used it with my children. Plato thought that it's very important to go to drinking parties and to learn how to dance, and to dance well. And people who didn't know how to drink well and dance well, you had to sort of use methods to encourage them to do so. Some of that would be the mockery of the group they were in. You don't dance well. Let's get you to dance well. You're not drinking properly. Let's get you to drink properly. Now, you certainly know that even in the most democratic societies, as Mill pointed out, there's a kind of, you might say, tyranny of the majority. That is, the views of other people can certainly act as rudders on the way you act. You're living in the suburbs, you don't care about mowing your lawn, all your neighbors are looking at you like you're an axe murderer. Pretty soon you come to mow your lawn. There's this kind of sense. So Plato's using both that notion that with social pressure, but the right kind of social pressure, students in their education will come to learn both how to dance properly, because he thought that kind of musical education was very important all the way up to becoming a philosopher, and even when you're a philosopher, and also drink properly. You have to learn the pleasures of alcohol in the right way. Dionysus was a god. So I'll just read a little of this passage. This is my only one. It was expensive 40 years ago. Okay, how's that? I think we're good? Now we're going to do politics at the end of this. Okay, here's what Plato said. Back to Plato and the Laws. It is then the virtue that first develops in children that I'm calling education. Hence, pleasure and love and pain and hatred develop correctly in souls not yet able to grasp an account. That is, so before, when he's talking about grasping an account, before you become rational, before you become rational adult agents, which I guess these days they say is 30. Is that the new, people have to live at home until they're 30 and then they become rational agents. Anyway, I don't know what it is, but he thought it was more like 17. Correctly in the souls not yet able to grasp an account. And when they do grasp the account, they agree with, this is Greek, it's a little pun, the account, that they have been correctly accustomed by appropriate habits. And this concordance is the whole of virtue. While the part of it that is correctly nurtured concerning pleasures and pains, so as to hate what should be hated straight away from beginning to end, and love what should be loved, by carving this very thing off in your account and naming it education, in my view, would be naming it correctly. So he's saying, from the very beginning, what you want is people to get to love the right things, hate the right things, things that are bad. That will become almost automatic. You will start to just get this sense. People talk about this in all kinds of pursuits. In sports, it's supposed to become sort of, keep doing it until you get it automatic. It's kind of training, this is training in ethics, until it becomes automatic. You just see something, you're supposed to hate it, you see something, you're supposed to love it, that's the way you go forward, and eventually, not exactly explained completely, you might say transparently, somehow your rationality kicks in from that process, and takes over, and you can understand why these things are good and why they are evil. Now, so that's a sort of the opening move of a lot of philosophers, even ones who don't necessarily value the emotions or think that hate is a bad thing. Most of them agree still that hate is very useful in the beginning, that by showing hatred to students, they feel that they're outside of a community. Kant, famously, because you might think Kant, who's all about mutual respect and we're supposed to respect each other and all that, in his lectures on pedagogy says, well, hatred, or he calls it, I'll say really, he calls it more contempt. Contempt is very important. You show young students contempt so they feel outside the moral community. They want to then become, part of the moral community. And rather than sort of telling Johnny, oh, that's fine. Yes, you're great. I'm not too worried about that. You show them and what they've done to show that it's contemptible. And Kant thinks that that's how, it's a very important part of moral pedagogy. Stoics, same thing. It's rather, to me, that was one of the big surprises. I didn't expect the people who were sort of, in general, against emotions like hate or anger, et cetera, to be saying, oh yeah, but for pedagogy, you need it. Now, the next thing that Plato does, and I think you'll find this, again, different people have different reactions. I certainly did when I was first thinking about it. He said, well, it's very important for societies as a whole to agree on what they hate and what they love. Now, of course, Plato is not talking about a contemporary, diverse society with all sorts of different people with different interests, different religions, etc. And you might say, well, okay, fine. That sort of just takes the wind out of his sails there. But Plato's still going to argue, no, even in that kind of society, if you want any sort of unity over some issues, and we might say, look, however diverse and however cantankerous and problematic relations are these days, people actually agree about a lot of moral things that, they may disagree about certain features, the way it's described, or what counts as that, but you might say they actually agree on, I don't think it's right to torture small children, let's say. You might say, nah, I'm a relativist. I don't want to. You know what? We don't have to go there. Plato's going to say, and in fact, most people would say, and let's say I think we could all say, that's not right. The question is, what should we do with that? Should we hate that? Or should we say, nah, that's something people do, and we let it go, and why worry about it? At least I'm not going to worry about it, etc. So however diverse the society, and remember, all the people who are writing in this vein think that they can tell you what's right and wrong. So we'll have that conversation. But if we can agree on certain things being right or wrong, we still have the question of, is hate an appropriate attitude towards things that are evil? So, when I look at this, how many of you read 1984? You read it? Yeah, that was an enthusiastic, it didn't sound too enthusiastic, but you probably read it 5 times going through school or something. I know how that goes. But anyway, you think of the kids, who are taught to hate Goldstein, and you think of, God, do I really want a society in which the kids are driven by that kind of hate? They hate Goldstein, and, they love Big Brother and all of that. And you might say, that's a kind of totalitarian reading of Plato that people worry about, and is this what happens when we're talking about love and hate? And I'd say, well, that certainly might be one possibility. And we also can think that the stuff going on in 1984 is completely problematic and wrong. I don't think that's Plato's view. I think he's thinking that, one of the things he's doing is not creating a society which is completely manipulated for particular purposes of unity, but to help certain people flourish and to make everyone do what they should do best, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But in any case, he does have the view that this is very important for social unity. Now, he also thinks, And I think this is an interesting one because it shows up a lot in psychology. In 4, I'll just read part of this. This is from the Laws. He's talking about people who can't be rehabilitated. There's a real problem. You know, he thinks there's some people, no matter what you do, you can't rehabilitate them. But he says, how do you get to that point? He says, well, he says here, either by actions or words, or pleasures and pains, or honors and disgrace, or monetary fines or gifts. These are all the ways you might try to slowly rehabilitate someone and get them to try to be just. And in general, anything by whatever means will make them hate injustice, but love, or at any rate, not hate the nature of true justice, which is actually the function of the best laws. So he says, look, what the laws are supposed to do is if you have people who, need rehabilitation, you might not be able to get them to love justice, because for Plato, only true philosophers who understand, the nature of justice and who have this kind of moral sort of outlook can actually come to love justice. But you can get people to hate injustice. We might not, love in our own lives. We may find it hard to love all these, but you can sort of hate injustice. And he thinks, as in much of the tradition, that somehow a hatred of injustice is much more ingrained in people. They don't necessarily love it, they're a little worried about it, but they really hate when they see injustice or things happening that they think are unjust. And people often talk about this in prison. What do prisoners hate? Well, there's certain things they really hate. They don't necessarily love justice as a whole, but there's certain kinds of activities which they find really, disgusting and horrible, and they hate them. And there's something in the tradition that says, deep down, we may not, all be philosophers who love stuff, but we can have a certain sense of there are injustices which go beyond the bounds, and we can be repelled by that. Now, the next thing I want to go to is I find it really interesting because it's the most central argument in Plato's great work, The Republic. He spends the whole Republic on with this account of education, which includes hate and love. He takes them all through. Philosophers have to do all these things. It takes them 40 years to get a certain kind of mental stuff. They got to do math. They got to do geometry. God knows what they got to do. They have to be out in the athletic fields. They have to fight. They get to a certain stage. And then he says, well, then they get there. And what is it that they do? Well, this is 5 on your handout. Let this indeed be agreed by us concerning the nature of philosophers, that they always love learning, at least that which reveals to them being that is always being, and is not wandering around between generation and destruction. So this is Plato's great metaphysical moment. What do we love? We love the things that have a nature, that are being, they're not changing, they're not, caught up in our individual perceptions, etc. But, if you know what being is, that's what you're supposed to love. He said, let it be agreed. And indeed, said I, of the whole of it, they willingly let go neither a smaller nor greater, nor more honored, nor less honored part, as we went through earlier concerning lovers and lovers of honor. Fine. So he's saying, you want to get it right, you want to have knowledge, you want to have all this stuff the philosopher has, you don't want to give up even a little part of it. That's what you want. What you say is correct, he said. Consider further then, whether it's necessary for those who are going to be such as these we were describing to have in addition this thing. Which thing? Absence of deceit and a willingness to accept falsity in no way whatsoever, but to hate it and to love the truth. And this becomes a central notion for people, that what hate does is it draws a moral boundary between what's good and bad. You love something, and there's this other stuff which can be false or problematic, but unless you really hate it, a number of things might happen to you. You might be kind of contagion. If you're around people who are saying horrific things and you're just sitting there going, yeah, okay, it slowly seeps into your soul in a certain way, that unless you really expunge it from yourself and hate it, you haven't really shown that you love the good. Now, we'll talk a little more about that. How are we doing? We go till 10 of, you said? 22 minutes. I will do 21 minutes. Just to show you. I had to put up with this guy as an undergraduate. He was always correcting us. Whenever we did, he had this phenomenal memory for text. You'd walk into class, you'd start talking, you go, yeah, but that's not what it says. He was like the most annoying, person. And then I'm sure he's still doing it. And I'm waiting. I'm just waiting. I came in going, okay, I'm going to go, and he's going to say that. Yeah, it's going to happen. And it was just going, okay, what can I do? He's got a better memory. Good for him. Anyway, let's go now to theology to avoid this. Okay, so now I'm going to turn to, this is a Christian writer, one of the Latin fathers. And this is I don't know if many people who read certainly the Testaments, or the Scriptures, goes under, hard to know what you're supposed to call all this stuff these days. So I'll say I'll say the Gospels, because I'm only going to refer to a Gospel here, and then we say the Hebrew Scriptures, and then Lactantius is sort of referring to this. There is certainly a very strong strain in which God hates bad things, hates certain peoples, loves others, and that Christ mimics that at various places. He was certainly all through the tradition, someone who, in Milton in Paradise Lost, I don't know if you've read Paradise Lost, but when Christ is introduced, he says, I want to hate everything that my Father hates. And he gives like this long list of stuff he hates, and I want to love everything that my Father hates. And people at the time, many were sort of, problematized by that, thought about that. But Milton was reflecting a certain strain of Christian theology, which comes from this passage, which we'll look at. But first let me read the Lactantius. Because another sort of justification for hate is that, well, since God does it, and I should mimic God as much as I can, there's my justification. So all through the tradition, there is a justification of hatred by the sort of, it's called odium Dei argument. And here's a version of it. For if God is not angry with the impious and the unrighteous, it's clear that he does not love the pious and the righteous. Therefore, the error of those is more consistent, who take away at once both anger and kindness. Here he's talking about the Stoics. Stoic God is providential God, has no emotions, and he says their error is not so bad because they get rid of both love and hate. It's the ones who only say that God only loves who get it wrong. For in opposite matters, it's necessary to be moved to both sides or to neither. Thus he who loves the good also hates the wicked, and he who does not hate the wicked does not love the good, because loving of the good arises from the hatred of the wicked, and the hating of the wicked has its rise from the love of the good. So he sees these as completely connected, that one comes from the other. There's no one who loves life without a hatred of death, nor who is desirous of light, but he who avoids darkness. These things are so connected by nature that the one cannot exist without the other. So this is a reflection, and if you go on and read Lactantius and the rest of actually the Greek fathers as well, Clement and all this, they all have no hesitation in saying that God loves and hates, and that we should mimic him to the best of our ability. Now, we don't have God's knowledge always, and always know what we're supposed to love and hate, but the idea that that's a model, and it's a moral model, is certainly strongly out there. Now, the next passage is from Luke. It's a very special passage in Luke, and various people come up with different arguments about this in different traditions, but it was one that certainly set down a kind of mandate for the monastic tradition. and I think you'll see why. Christ says in Luke, if someone comes to me and does not hate, the Greek word mise, his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters and even his own soul, he's not able to be my student. Now, what does he mean by that? Well, the argument is, if you want to follow Christ who is good, you have to hate all these other things because guess what? They're not. You have to carve off a moral boundary, draw a moral boundary around what is good, which is Christ, and everything else which isn't, you have to hate, because if you don't hate it, you'll still be connected to it. It will still drag you down. It will still infect you. It will still be a force of contagion. And this is reflected again in Plato, in 8, and he says, it's not probable or even inevitable that the result will be exactly the same as whenever someone living among the wicked habits of bad men does not hate, but accepts and delights in them, yet blames them merely in a spirit of play, as if being in a dream about one's own wickedness. Then, to be sure, inevitably, the person so delighted becomes similar. This is this word homoouthai. You begin to be very similar to the people around you who are doing wicked things, to whatever they delight in, even though ashamed to praise it. Yet what greater good or evil would we say befalls us so completely inevitably? So the idea is, you know this, you know about peer pressure, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, if you're around people who are doing wicked things and you just sort of tolerate it, you don't push back, you don't try to avoid contact, you are in some way giving into it, and both from the Judeo-Christian tradition and also the ancient pagan tradition, the idea is, yeah, and you will start to reflect that. You'll become like the stuff that you disapprove of or that you hate if you don't actually really hate it. So that is an idea about drawing moral boundaries. To go back to the Plato passage about the philosophers, one of the things that the argument is, and this is something that Hume picks up, and Hume is a person who wrote about, rather than rationality, more the importance of the emotions. And his view is what hate does. If you really hate something, there's a kind of, in the notion of moral epistemology or theory of knowledge, by hating something, you get to really know something. I mean, you could say, I hate something, and if you don't really hate it, you really won't know why you hate it. So for both Plato and, again, the whole tradition, there's something about hatred that helps you learn about the vices of others, the problems of others. By hating them, you come to learn them. If you sort of are very indifferent about it, you're not going to learn about them, you're not going to care about them. And they also make the argument, which these days, again, sounds very problematic from what we usually hear from psychologists, teachers, etc., about the importance of self-hatred. That is, you're often told, certainly by psychologists, that, well, you got some stuff wrong with you, and you should accept it. That's you. Or you should learn to enjoy it. Or, again, that's the way you are, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Plato's view is, well, that's not right. If you have some horrific vice, you should hate it. And that means hating yourself for having it and getting rid of it. And that's what's very important. And if you just sort of let it go and say, yeah, that's me, well, that's not a way of morally improving yourself. And that's something actually that the Stoics, actually it's really amusing that Marcus Aurelius, who's the most sort of serene kind of writer, says, nothing bothers me, everything's cool. Yes, my troops are killing millions of Gauls, but who cares? I mean, I'm very cool and it's all very nice. Life is grand. And then one thing he says is, well, when people say horrible things about you and hate you, you should check it out and see if maybe they've caught on to something about you that you should get rid of. So it's actually very useful in moral self-improvement. And also your own hatred for your own vices And come on, you know what they are. If you really hated them, you might get rid of them. That's what the argument is. Now, I want to close by saying two things. First is very quick, and that is, how many of you have read Thucydides with Professor Rosenblum? Yeah, there you are. Okay. Now, you know, this will be music to your ears. Molly, isn't that your name?
That is.
See, I've got Kreskin here, can pick out names. Let's see. Lonnie. Okay, see? Randolph? Okay, I got it here. Okay, so Thucydides says, what often happens is that in fraught times, words begin to change their meaning. And what used to be something becomes something else, and the pressures of all that change things. And I can say, we might want to look at the way hate is used exactly in that kind of context. Because hate and love were never, they didn't float free from the content and their objects. It was not that hate is bad and love is good. It's that love of certain things is good and hate of other things is good. That is, the content of what you hate is what defines what it is. If you hate, look, I'll give you a whole list of things. You hate sexism, you hate racism, you hate inequality, you hate all this stuff. The argument used to be, that's fine. That's good hate. That's moral hate. You should do that. There's a content to your hatred. So when a sign says, no hate allowed here, you're saying, I don't know what that means because it's not telling me what I'm hating. Same thing with love. When people say, yes, love is the answer. Yeah, you know, I love to start forest fires. That's not the answer. So what's happened is that those terms have lost their meaning in a certain way because they're no longer connected to the things that actually define them. And the whole tradition, up until really the 19th century, and I'm not going to talk about that, we can talk about it in the thing, was very aware of that these were defined by their objects. And I think that's sort of one of the morals of what you can get out of the tradition. You might disagree, and you might say, and there's certainly all kinds of reasons to disagree, but I would say that's one of the thrusts of the tradition, to say that, you know, the content of emotional attitudes really matters, and you don't judge them when they're free of that. Now, the final thing, I have a few minutes, because this is where Professor Rosenblum got his hackles up with me. So I'm going to go out, try to say something about it, and that's the following question. So you often hear the expression, well, you don't hate the sinner, you hate the sin. And that actually, if you look through, the first time that comes out is Augustine. Augustine's the first person, I think, who makes that argument. And he uses it for a very particular reason, very particular theological, very particular metaphysical reading, because he thinks that, in fact, when you're looking at human beings, they have an element in them which is free from any kind of other properties and has a value in itself. So here is a short little metaphysical question. And we can do this with friendship, because many of you have friends. I know you got thousands on your phones. You might even have one or two real ones. I doubt it, but you may, you may, but we'll say friendship. So in friendship, we say the following. I'll ask the following. And this was a quandary put by the great French theorist Jacques Derrida, who liked to put quandaries. And he said, well, why is it that we have friends? Why do we like them? Do we like them for their properties? Or do we like them for who they are, whatever that means, without their properties? And a number of problems begin to arise if you start thinking in that way. Because you say, yeah, why do I like this friend? I like them because they're really funny. Why do I like my wife? Well, my wife, she's amusing. I like her for that. You might say, well, if you like her for her property, of amusing, there's other people more amusing. Don't you like that person more? If you like her for being amusing, don't you like Chappelle's more amusing than my wife. Shouldn't I like Chappelle more than my wife? I have many nods. If you're thinking about people in terms of their properties. Now you might say, okay, no. People are, they're not just one property, they're a bunch of properties. But you know what philosophers can do? You know what Jacques Derrida could do? Say, put all the number of properties you want. I will find you that very set of properties, and then one more person. They can cook a wonderful quiche. Wouldn't you prefer that person? They have that property. So the one problem is, if you think that what you value in people is their properties, you have a number of problems. First of all, there could certainly be other people that instantiate these properties more, and you should keep trading up. Well, every high school movie's about that. You have your old friends, they're really kind of lame, not popular. You're supposed to hang out with them, and then the new really hip, cool people, whatever they're called these days, they come in, mean people, whatever people like. They come in, and then you go with them, and you go, oh yeah, and then you feel bad about the ones you left behind, and all that. You know what? If you really enjoy people for their properties, just go with the new set, if the properties are good. Now, on the other side of the equation is, well, no, wait a minute. I'm married to Johnny. He beats me. He's never held a job. He runs around on me. He crashed the car. I can't think of really one positive property, but I love him because he's Johnny. I love Johnny. All his properties, I can't name one good thing about him, but I love him. And so Derrida was going to say, really? How do you love a bare particular? Maybe, you don't realize it. You love Johnny because you love his dimple, and you think his dimple outweighs all the rest of the stuff. Perhaps. You sometimes hear arguments about that. Unfortunately, Anthony Appiah made an argument like this, and he's a famous philosopher. He was talking about Debbie Boone and why, I said, really, Anthony? Come on. Anyway, he went down on the dimple argument, I have to admit. It's not, But we still have the quandary. And the quandary goes back to David scowling at me. That is, when we hate the sin, what is it that we hate? Do we hate the property, or do we hate the person? Now, if you're Augustine, you can say, well, the property has nothing to do with the person. We love people, we don't care about their properties. Many other people would argue, say, what do you mean? There's nothing to love if you don't have the properties. When you hate the sin, you're hating the properties. So you actually hate the person. It's not that you can separate those in the way that Augustine wants you to. So it's not, and you certainly see this in Plato. Plato doesn't say, if you come to the person who can't be rehabilitated, he doesn't say, oh, I hate the fact that you can't come to, hating justice. He just says, you know what? Sorry, you don't belong in our society. It's not that we're going to cut you some value independently of your various properties. So that's one of the quandaries that lies at that particular question. Because people would say, yeah, I get it, I can hate all these abstractions, but how about when we make the next step? And that's certainly much more problematic, much more troubling. The questions of rehabilitation, of upbringing, all of this, and you can have all those. Still the question, and I don't want to necessarily, we can talk about that, but sort of the overall upshot, I would say, of the tradition is that, well, if you want to be a moral agent, you have to learn to hate things that are bad. How far that extends, if it extends from abstractions, properties, etc., to evil individuals, that's something that we can let the philosophers talk about, think about some more. This is just sort of a news flash from antiquity, which raises these questions. And one of the things I said I might say about, very quickly, how this came to disappear in the tradition after Burke. One is, after Burke, moral philosophy in the West, as we often hear, got divided between two camps that for about over 100 years have been arguing back and forth at each other, and no one moves, they can't do anything. Moral philosophy is frozen between the utilitarians, consequentialists, from Mill on. Hate's not a problem for them. Why? Because they're interested in various kinds of consequences. They can be worried about hate speech because they're worried about how that works in a liberal society, but they're not worried about the emotions as such and the role of hatred and love and all of that. They just want to know, what happened here and how did that turn out? Was it a good turnout? Kant, on the other hand, was taken to, and is rightly taken, to argue that, well, no, moral philosophy is based on certain moral attitudes towards others. We treat everyone with equal respect. They respect us back. This is what the categorical imperative is about, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and there's no room for hate. Well, there's not in his official line, but as I said in his articles on pedagogy, he thinks there's room for contempt. But most people haven't really cared about that, and they looked at the official line. And so if you look at the two big, you might say, theories going, there's really no room for hate. A little while later, back about 20 years ago, ancient philosophers, they got very interested in something they called virtue ethics, which was supposed to be a path between the two, onward and upward. I hate to tell you, I don't think there's much hope for that, because Aristotle himself says the reason you're doing things is because they're right. He sounds very Kantian, and many of the things he's very Kantian. Other people are consequentialists, whether there's some midway between, but no virtue theorist they talk about the various virtues you're supposed to have. They never say hate is one. So wait a minute, you're a virtue theorist. You're supposed to be reading Aristotle. How come we don't treat hate as one of the great virtues? Can't you live a wonderful life hating things? Think of the great figures in literature. Danton, maybe Ahab, or somebody who's going around writing injustices all the time and hates the people who committed them. Couldn't that be a kind of life of eudaimonia and flourishing? Doesn't seem like Aristotle or Plato can actually avoid that argument if they think that these two things are important in their own right. I see steam coming out over here, so I'm not even going to look. Anyway, so I'll leave you with those thoughts, and we can chat about them if you like.
Okay, well, Professor Mitsis, are you willing to entertain questions?
I will entertain them until the dawn.
I'm sure you will. And I have a feeling that they might go on until the dawn.
Beyond the dawn.
The comments and the questions.
And maybe, yes.
Let's open the floor. Questions, comments?
Yes.
So early on you mentioned how hate can be useful either on an emotional level or on a rational level.
Yes.
Do you think that there's a meaningful difference between those two, emotional hate and rational hate?
Well, that's a very interesting question, because I'd say the following. When people typically, like Plato, when he talks about rational hate, you might say, look, I hate something. My kind of rational hate doesn't really affect the thing being hated or the person being hated. I may hate you, but what do you care? It's not directly affecting you. And one of the things that he points out too is the difference between hating and love. Hating tends to repel things away. So when you hate something, you're not connected to it exactly in the same way. We can talk about different versions of that, but love tends to unify. So the problem for Plato is you're always bringing things into yourself and orbit that are very problematic in a way that you don't with hate. So when you're thinking about this at a moral level, morality helps you in a particular way, and that kind of hatred helps to sort of put a clean you might say, barrier between you and what's bad. Now, the people who talk about hate in an emotional way, which certainly Aristotle and much of the tradition, Darwin, you think Hobbes, many of these people, when they talk about hatred, they're talking about some aggressive attitude towards someone that manifests in certain desires and actions. And you might say, for instance, Aristotle, I mean, when I'm writing on this and I call him the father of genocide, because he thinks when you hate something, you want to annihilate it, you want to make sure it doesn't exist. You know, he has this really sort of chilling passages about what hatred can do. So I would say that, now it doesn't have to be that way, but I would say the emotional, the people who emphasize the emotional qualities of hatred, it's usually more somehow aggressive, interactive, and you want to cause harm to the object. Whereas Plato, it's really, you don't necessarily cause harm, you just want to cut yourself off from it by understanding it. It's more of an intellectualized kind of hate. Although in Plato, it can lead to action in the same way. But it's not this kind of emotional, initial rush to sort of destroy something that we can think of hatred in that way. Now, again, in both those cases, Aristotle is going to say, look, if you're destroying something horrible, you have the emotional rush, that's perfectly fine. That's morally fine. It's just a different kind, he has a different view of human psychology. And in the Republic, by the time you get up to this level of the Republic, the philosophers are becoming almost purely rational agents who have cured themselves from everything on the way down. Their thumos, their desires, they've become, I don't know, a Vulcan or something. I mean, they just sort of, they have that. So, they're not going to have that emotional urge in the way that's Aristotle's living in the world and the kind of sociology in which there's competition and people arguing, hating, doing this. And so for him, it's actually, let me destroy my opponent. But I think that's very broad. And you can see it in different ways. I mean, in the tradition, Spinoza has it more Aristotelian. Hume is, you might say, a little more Platonic because he's British and nice in certain ways. I don't know. But those are the twin poles. I think you're right about that. And Plato, he moves between them because he first starts with your initial instincts and your education before you become purely rational. So at those stages, you're likely going to have this. When you're a kid and someone's not drinking correctly and not dancing correctly, you might be a little more aggressive as opposed to purely rational about the way you show your disapproval. Yes, Molly.
Something that struck me when you were describing Kant's pedagogical weaponization of hate.
Ooh, weaponization of hate. There's a term.
But it's play for play, an abuser tactic to show contempt to somebody.
Well, look,
signal to them
you know what?
an outsider status.
We can use all kinds of contemporary terminology to turn things in different ways. You can say, oh, there he goes mansplaining again. No, I'm just trying to give you a rational argument. Or there we go that. So when you're calling it an abuser thing, I think Kant is saying, here's a perfectly competent German schoolmaster in Freiburg, and his student does something horrible, and he says, you are beneath contempt for doing this. Now, is that an abuser tactic? I mean, is it long term? Is he out to gain something from the abuse?
Is he honest about it, though? Is he
Yes.
feigning rejection in order to...
No, he's saying very clearly, Kant is saying very clearly, you have done something horrific. We have contempt for you. Stand in the corner, and then you will come to see what you've done wrong. Now, I mean, I'm always very, look, maybe philosophers aren't subtle enough, and when they're talking about these kinds of psychological things, you might say that, and maybe, yeah, we can view that as a kind of teacher abuse. And yeah, in the old days, teachers could do all kinds of stuff, and the boomers say, well, I don't get it. The guy slugged me, and it was good for me. We can't say that anymore. What? Why, he says. What? Who can't say that? Anyway, no, but you see what I'm saying, that we can put it in, I would say, contemporary psycho-speak, and that's the way most people look at these issues now. Saying the philosophical tradition was viewing it more in a less, you might say it's less nuanced. I'm not going to necessarily defend it. I'm just sort of saying, here was the view, and the view was, if I show my strong contempt for what you've done as a child, is that abuse? You put the cat in the microwave. Is that abuse if I say, I just, that's horrible, that's disgusting. I do not view you as a fellow human being for doing that. Are you? If you put the cat in the microwave, shouldn't you be thrown a little out of the bounds of the human moral command and said, yeah, you can earn your way back in?
Is it okay to put the kid in the microwave?
Put the kid?
The cat in the microwave.
I don't think Kant is saying, I think contempt is not.
I'm sorry, I know.
Contempt doesn't, no, contempt for a child who's done something wrong doesn't lead to killing them. I don't think he views that. He doesn't say you need to kill the kids who you show contempt for. I don't think he goes that strong. That's an idea, though. I should think about that. Many people who have cats might, you know how they are. They're crazy about it. Yes. Jesus said one time, yes.
To love your enemies and bless those who curse you.
He did say that.
etc.
He said the two great commandments are to love God with all your heart and to love your neighbor with all your heart.
Is this compatible with
The problem about the compatibility of the Gospels is always one that's very charged. And many scholars of the Gospels think that there are many places where different things are said in different ways. Now, I picked this one out because it led to a whole tradition, a monastic tradition, where monks went out into the desert and they hated everything except Christ, supposedly, and some of them lived alone. And the idea was, if you're being exceedingly pure, you get to follow Christ in that way. Now, when Christ says, love your neighbor, love God, is that the same kind of demand? You might say, that's some kind of more general demand. That's not for the people going out who want to be the, top of the line followers of Christ. Because loving your neighbor, yeah, okay, I love my neighbor. Does that mean I'm following Christ the way that Christ says, throw away all your possessions, do all of that, do all that? It's a much less demanding commandment. So you might say there are different levels of following Christ. There are those who say, yes, I love my neighbor, and I also make a lot of bucks and have a big house. And there's other ones when Christ, remember, he talks and says, look, you have to throw away everything. And the guy goes, oh, I do? Maybe I'll take a pass on that. And then this one, I would say, is the very strongest one that says, if you really want to follow Christ the way Christ demands, to only, to draw a moral boundary around Christ and everything else, it's not a matter of loving your neighbor. It's a matter of hating everything, because your neighbor, how much you love your neighbor is probably evil, right? Problematic? Aren't your neighbor? Take a look around you. What do you see? A mass of evil. So if you really want to follow Christ, reject all of this, reject your family, even hate your own soul, and only love Christ. So that's why I say this is the most stringent moral commandment in Luke and in the Bible. And it's also the one in which, in this particular passages, Christ is really taking on the mantle of his Father and trying to show that, I'm like my Father, and my Father has these demands, and I have these demands. In that particular stretch of Luke, something like that's going on, I think. Not everyone agrees. Yes?
Yeah, going on to the whole hating everything that isn't God.
Yes.
How does that play into the whole God created everything, humanity's in God's image? Or is that just not considered?
Well, no. One of the things that God, if you want to be in God's image, what does God do? He hates bad things. He loves good things. You want to be in God's image? The imago Dei, you have to do the odium Dei. So if you really want to, in the terms here are homoiosis, to become like, to become one with, to become similar, like Tancius argues, then that's what you have to do, because that's what God does. So it fits perfectly in that sense. Yes?
So, is it in the Republic that Plato says that that evil or wrongdoing is just the ignorance of good?
That's in Socrates. That's in the Apology, where he has the view that, yes, it's just ignorance. By the time he gets to the Republic, it's not just ignorance. There's all the other parts of the psyche, and it's not just a matter of knowledge. It's a matter of your thumos, your anger, et cetera, isn't correctly set. Your desires are problematic. Socrates has this kind of strictly rationalist account. Now, there's arguments about how much Plato follows this in different ways, and how and also with Aristotle. They sometimes look like they follow it a lot, that they want this kind of strong rationalist anchor when they're talking about morality, but they're also trying to build in habituation, they're trying to build in the nature of your desires, education, etc. Because for Socrates, when you start off, any two people can start talking and you can get it right. For Plato and Aristotle, what's Plato say? It's too late for all of you, unless you started right. And what do I have to do now as Plato? I have to get rid of you and start over again. Or at least go somewhere else and start all over again.
So Marcus Aurelius, who you mentioned, because he seems to be saying, none of this stuff is deserving of hate, because nobody's even choosing to do it. So you shouldn't be angry, because nobody's really guilty, because they're not doing evil because
well, I don't know. I don't necessarily agree with that particular thing because of the following. Because the Stoics are certainly determinists in some broad way, but they also think that through various proximate causes, you are responsible for what you're doing. You don't get it free. They're not fatalists. The difference between a fatalist and a determinist is, fatalist says, no matter what you do, it's going to come out the same way. So you shouldn't try to do anything. That's known as the lazy argument. The Stoics refuse that. They say, no, you're determined to do certain things by the whole course of the universe, but part of what determines you is your own input into that, and your input is remarkably free. You get to assent to anything you want. You are free to assent to things. So your assent is part of the causal story and part of the determination. But the fact that Marcus is, his armies are killing Gauls, no true Stoic of the Greek variety. Look, Roman Stoicism, whatever, that's what they do when they sit around and have Stoicons and, Lazard and talk about being Stoics. They're not. The ancient Stoics, first of all, they didn't believe in armies. Ancient Greek Stoics didn't believe in money, didn't believe in warfare, didn't believe in killing Gauls, didn't believe in any of that stuff. So, Marcus is not what I would call a true Stoic. He is a Stoic who's very good for packaging on the internet for people who don't want to be true Stoics, because that's hard. I think there was a hand over here. Yes. Sorry, let me come over and hear you.
So Plato teaches us to love what is moral and hate what is immoral.
Yes.
But how do we reconcile the idea that people have different ideas of what is and is?
Well, look, it's very easy for Plato because he thinks he's going to tell you what's wrong. He's saying, we're going to argue this all out. As good philosophers, we're going to figure out what's right and wrong. And so for him, it's very easy to say what's right and wrong. I say, look, yeah, we live in a diverse society. We have all sorts of things. We have all sorts of problems. We can't always agree. The point is, Plato's still going to say, he's not going to say, but we can say for him, yeah, okay, here we all are. Can't we agree on some certain moral properties being right and others wrong? I would be very surprised if you would say no. Because if you try to keep your argument that there's no such thing, you're going to run into all sorts of difficulties in trying to defend it. Because the first thing, if you say, hey, I think, pick something that you think is wrong. Okay, let's do racism. You think racism is wrong. And I say, what do you mean? What's wrong about that? And we start having, according to Plato, we start having a conversation. And if I say, well, why I think it's right? Because of X. And you say, that's wrong. I say, well, no, it's because of X. And you say, no, that's false. Plato's going to say that if you sit there doing dialectic and arguing enough, you will probably come to some basic moral truths about human beings. I started off with my feeling about equality. That was just an emotional thing. I hated being treated that way. I understand people don't like being treated that way. And my view is, I don't see any justification for treating people that way. Other people might say, look, I'm a vegan. You say, why are you a vegan? I can't see one justification for eating animals. There's no moral justification for eating animals. You might like the taste of, Chipotle, but that's not a moral justification. I mean, and it was very interesting because a while ago on the main philosophical blog, somebody raised that very question. How many philosophers are vegans? How many philosophers are this? Pescatarians. They went through the whole thing. And what came out of it was, there was not one philosopher anywhere in the Western canon or anywhere that could actually give a moral justification for killing and eating animals. There were all sorts of traditional, societal, taste, all of that. Tell me the reason, what do you have a moral reason for killing a cow and eating it? Well, if you could come up with one, we could have an argument, we could do that. But Plato would say, if you sat and really thought about it and didn't give in to just sort of, they got meatloaf today, barbecue sauce on it, really tasty. Say, okay, that's fine. But are you really being serious about being a moral agent and thinking what that might have cost to the suffering animal? Do you care about that? So, I mean, Plato can make those kinds of arguments. People can make those kinds of arguments. You can take them or lose them, but you might say, if you come up with an argument, we don't have to do animals, we can do destroying the environment. I'm assuming you all think that destroying the environment and my argument is bad for the future. Yeah? We can give a lot of reasons. Should you hate that? Should you hate the fact that by the time you're 25, you're going to have water up to your neck wherever you're at and trying to figure out where to go and go, how'd that happen? Thank you, boomers. Thank you, world. Thank you, Jeff Bezos. You made $1 trillion and I'm here up to my neck in water. And you get to go to another planet in your spaceship. How'd that work out? So, I mean, you can have those kinds of arguments. And Plato would say, I mean, he has his own arguments for what's good, what's bad, et cetera, but I think that then the question is, well, should we hate that or not? So, I mean, you're having the big question of philosophy, are all our moral beliefs relative, or can we come up with some kind of justifications for certain kinds of moral beliefs, or even if they're just procedural, that we can all agree that we're all going to have certain procedural sorts of things that we can agree on and live with, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's all. Yes. I don't know if you heard any of that because I was addressing myself over here. You heard it? Okay. We're going for burgers tonight? No. Let's go. Yes. Yes.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for this talk, first of all. I've been thinking a lot about two things as you've been talking. One is how the individual experience of love-hate tracks onto the social.
Yes, absolutely.
I feel like that's really well answered towards the end of number 3, where it compares the soul to the polis. And then the other thing I've been thinking about is how, what does love and hate look like? And you brought up a bunch of times that there's a lot of answers to that, depending on who you are and where you come from. And so my question, I guess, is bringing those two things together.
Yeah. No, I think you're right that that's very difficult because in Plato it's much easier because of exactly that city-soul analogy and the individual soul and that and all that, which we don't have. And one of the things that I think, when I read the Burke, remember Burke is a conservative in a particular conservative tradition in which he thinks that, he's not so keen on diversity and toleration. It's it's one of the last voices for that. And it's easy to say, look, in a society in which things are so diverse, let's say that we as individuals learn to track these various things. But how does that, I could say, look, we have all these wonderful moral agents walking around. How does that, what's the payoff when we look at the world chaos around us and the fact that you could be a perfectly wonderful moral individual and you can feel that you're powerless? So how do we make that transition between individual to society? Plato, obviously, this is first of all, the Republic is a kind of thought experience thought experiment and thought experience, which, we're in the thick of it and we don't have that luxury. And so, yeah, certainly one of the questions is, but look, certain groups are trying to make their particular views about what's morally important to become, and it's happened. I mean, my God, I see this. There were no girls in my chemistry class. No one would have thought of it. My daughter's a chemist. And you go, okay, there's a transition. Why was it? Well, because people start thinking that, you know what? Guess what? Women can do science. Not everyone's convinced. There's still tons of, do we know how horrific it is for women to go up? And we saw all that. I saw that in my own family. It's still very difficult, but it has changed. You can say that about other things. And you can say, well, there are ways in which, those particular moral insights can bubble up and sort of have influence, and they can start shaping societies in a particular way. And I think, to someone who's seen the 50s to now, I mean, however horrific it is, and I'm certainly never going to say that any of these questions of sexism, equal pay, any of that have even been vaguely adequately addressed, but it's still way different, and there's hope, and there's things that are doing, and you can say, well, there's one. And you can start taking other ones. People might disagree about how much has actually happened. But I think the view is there can be these kinds of movements between, and also then the social certainly influences people's views. I mean, if you're watching all sorts of people on television, it's different than watching the Jetsons. There's a whole different thing. So I think that there's some possibility of what you're talking about that for Plato is very easy and constructed, but we can still see that happening between social, sort of social configurations and individuals. Yes?
I'm just curious about the shift away from this framework of thinking which was so influential for so long. You said that, I don't know much about the history of philosophy, but you said that happened around the end of the 19th century.
Yes.
And I was curious about the reasons for that. You mentioned utilitarianism. I don't know, is that what explains it? Or
No, I'd say it was a combination of two things. That moral philosophy. Now you might say, okay, because moral philosophy, froze in a way that didn't care about this, why should that have changed the way people talk about it in our cultures and the way people think about it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You might say, look, who said philosophy had such a great influence? You've always got that side of the question. So my first thing is just to chart sort of philosophical history, and I'd say the philosophical history is pretty straightforward in that the utilitarians don't care about that. It's not important to them. That's not what they're thinking about when they're talking about consequences in a society. They're all different sorts of things. How you get there is not particularly worrisome for them. Same thing with Kant. And I'd say same thing for the, virtue ethicists of the past 20 years. It's just not a feature of that. So I'd say that's certainly the case at the level of philosophy, and I was talking about this at the level of philosophy. Now you might say, what about our culture? Why has that turned in that direction? Well, there's another feature of this that I didn't mention, but we see it all over the place, and it's the notion of forgiveness, which also, there's no forgiveness until about the 19th century. People say, you're looking at me and say, wait a minute, didn't Christ say forgive them for they know not what they do? That's not what the Greek says. There's nothing about forgiving them. It's that they've done something wrong and, let them off in the same way you let someone off that did something else. There's no sense of forgive in the Greek. There's no forgiveness until about the 19th century. And so you might say, when I look at the way those things come together, okay, so let's take a typical daily example in America. There's a school shooting. And, 20 kids get shot. And the newspapers they always come around and talk to the parents. You never see a parent saying, that person killed my kid. I hate them. They should rot in hell. What do they always say? Well, I forgive them and I I hope that my child, they give you this sort of, I would say, look, check your own intuitions about what's right. Somebody, attack my daughter in the park. I'm going to go, I hate that. And I hate the person who did it. Sorry. That's one, you might say, one kind of response. But we have been ritualized for certain reasons for, I just find it amazing. The parents have to go up through that ritual, oh yes, I forgive the perpetrator. Well, first of all, in the tradition, the only person who could forgive anybody in the whole Christian tradition was God. And the only person you could sin against was God. The whole point was it's your relation with God. Only God can forgive you. You can only sin against God. That was the tradition, again, up until the 19th century. And that started to change. So I think there was this, I think part of it was sort of a general notion, and I don't want to say liberalism because you're going to think, oh my God, take your MAGA hat off and leave me alone. It's not that. I would say liberalism in the sense that we now live in these larger communities where it's harder to say, what's right and wrong about a lot of things. Also that religion lost a certain sort of, you might say, power over the ascription of sin and forgiveness. I look back, the Checker speech, Clinton, they're all up there saying, I did all this. Every dime store preacher on TV who, is having an affair says, oh, forgive me. And in the old days, they would have said, we don't forgive you. God forgives you, and I don't see that God's going to forgive you. What are you getting from us? And the same thing is, and then I have no reason to hate you for what you've done because I have to forgive you. So I think there's this whole notion of different moral attributes have gotten mixed up in particular ways. But I think it's very easy to see this, like in these ritual sort of laments when parents get on and have to talk about somebody killing their child. And you go, why, isn't this perverse in a certain way? Or not. People are going to have different views about that. But I think that's the explanation for that kind of view. And if you look back over the traditions of Greek tragedy, literature all the way through, it's not viewed as an appropriate response or even one that happens. Are you going to lower the boom now? You're going to lower the guillotine? Oh, okay. So you're going to lower the guillotine after I think I'm walking out on my own? Okay, go.
So you mentioned how philosophical progress sort of stopped and things broke at a certain point, like after Burke, he said?
Well, and after Kant and the utilitarians, and I didn't say progress, I said a particular way of looking at the world and these problems had been pretty standard up until then. Then it changed. And I'm not saying, I wasn't claiming necessarily it's better or for worse. I think there's certainly some problems with the way it's changed. Okay?
All right, I must have misheard. You said progress, and I'm thinking, what is philosophical progress?
No, I wasn't saying progress. No, I was saying there was progress since 1950 on certain issues like, sexism. We would hope racism, I'm not convinced, but certainly sexism, you say, there are more women in science departments. If that's a sign of, less sexism, I don't know. I certainly have lots of colleagues who say, what are you talking about? That's feminism for the 1%. The great mass, 90% of the women in the world, they're not chemists. Their lives are still the same. So don't talk to me about progress. And I'm very sympathetic to that argument. I'm just saying in our little world of academia and colleges and the people you're looking around with, yeah, you can have women in your science classes now. That's better. It's not solve the problems around the world. And, I might say 99% of the women around the world could care less if there's some women doing chemistry. They want other things in their lives. So that was my little, you might say, false consciousness blink about some moral progress in some little area of our lives and, maybe the possibility of doing more.
last question. Go ahead.
No pressure, no pressure.
I think you mentioned that you spent 10 years in
Abu Dhabi, I did.
So I was wondering, since you typically think of the Middle East as more strongly religious, did they, at least during your time there, have like this intuition of you have to hate more strongly things that you disapprove of, or is it like entirely on its own?
Not at all. Well, look, in my own, one of the things when you go to a country where there's a kind of, you might say there were 1 million people who are in the Emirates, and then they have 9 million people working for them. Your actual straightforward connection with the people you're working for is pretty slight. I got to know a few people through my daughter's school, and we would occasionally get invited over, and you have those kind of conversations. You didn't find it all. I mean, I found it much easier to talk about any issue I wanted to in Abu Dhabi than I can at NYU. People were completely open to talking about anything. That included when we were reading Dante, and I was reading along. I said, yeah, we should all read Dante. I started reading Dante, and I get the book, and I go, oh my God, I forgot Muhammad is in hell, and look what they're doing to them. And I'm going, oh my God, what am I going to say in class? And I had 3 Emiratis saying, oh, I found this very interesting about Christian attitudes towards Muhammad and the Renaissance, and I want to write a paper on it. And I went, whew, whether that would happen elsewhere, whether it would happen in New York, no clue. So my general thing, I didn't, I couldn't gauge it. I don't read Arabic. I don't know what the papers were saying in Arabic. I was reading a very sort of anodyne view of what people were talking about. So but to the extent that the Quran follows, scripture, Hebrew scripture, and also that Christ is a kind of revered figure in Islam, and people know these texts, and they're doing that, I would say, I think, I don't know how lively it is. I mean, you might say, contemporary Christians who are reading these texts, how lively is it for them? Is it lively? I don't know. Did Bart Ehrman say you should look at it? I have no clue. But it would certainly be there in the text for people to look at, and I don't know how they take it.
Okay, well, please join me.
So I ended up with an I don't know, which is perfect.
That's great.
That's where I go.